Moreover, you heard earlier about the idea of nanoparticulate matter that can be utilized in a weaponizable way. And here too, we're looking very, very strongly at what nanoparticulate matter can do to the nervous system. Some ongoing studies with our colleagues in the medical branches of NATO have in fact shown that the use of nanoparticulate matter in a scatter arrangement can be used to incur what looks to be broad-scale epidemiological stroke epidemics. So what we're able to do here is infiltrate the brain space with nanoparticulate matter that aggregates in situ, on site in the brain, and does one of two things. Either penetrates from the vascular space, gets in through the bloodstream, gets in through the nose, through the mucosa, or infiltrates the vascular space and clogs it. What is the result? What's called a nanoparticulate stroke, or a hemorrhagic diathesis, fancy word, for it's a predisposition to individuals having brain bleeds. Demonstrated? Oh, absolutely. We're able to show animal models of same, and the Italian group has done a fair amount of work demonstrating that nanoparticulate matter can be highly disruptive, not only of brain vascularity, but brain function. You may not necessarily incur a stroke, but you're going to begin to disrupt the network properties of the brain, and as a result, engage something more of a long wars effect through the use of these types of matters, where you now begin to influence the population in increasingly concentric circles of expansion. We can develop a variety of different drugs that can be used in war-fighting scenarios. Now, what I want to make sure you understand is that these drugs can not only enhance the warfighter with regard to maximizing their particular capability, but can also be used to maximize war-fighting capability by then affecting others. So clearly, I can affect others by either what I'm doing, making me better, or what I do to them, making them, quote, less better, or at very, very least, not wanting to fight. In the main, these are indeed weapons of mass disruption, not destruction. And the reason that I mention this to you is that that absence of mass destruction has in some cases veiled them for closer scrutiny, but the disruptive effect can be huge. So for example, one of the things that we can do is we can use a variety of these new forms of drugs that target specific functions of the nervous system, such things like affiliation, amelioration, attitudes, behaviors, and cognitions, and we can target key individuals. Earlier this morning, we had a general who spoke to all of us, and he gave us a very rousing message and talked to us how specifically we need to engage science and technology. If I were, for example, able to modify the coffee that he drank, the water that he drank this morning, with an undetectable chemical that was delivered at a very, very low range, and he gets up before you and he says, "This is all bunk, ladies and gentlemen, you shouldn't be here in this room. I don't believe a word of what I'm going to hear, and my particular concern is, with regard to the United States Army, is we should move in other directions, and we should basically work on potting flowering plants." You'd think one of two things. Either he's completely gone wackadoodle and lost his rocker, or I'm going to follow this guy to the end of the earth because he's not only a power-driven leader, he is in fact a charismatic leader who I believe in. So the ability to affect a single individual, whether it is a military leader, a political leader, or a diplomat, through the use of modifiable brain functions at very, very low levels of non-detectable drugs that exist in the high nano range, is in fact creating a ripple effect by virtue of their followers, either an affiliative effect or a disruptive effect. Moreover, we recognize we can also use a variety of microbiological agents to incur a whole host of morbidities, but not necessarily mortality. And what we may want to do is to utilize these first two in such a way that creates a very, very broad ripple effect to then essentially dissolve the fiduciary between the public and the public health. Let me give you an example, and it's an example that I used in a recent article that I wrote for the Defense News. And I'll give it to you very, very briefly. What I do is I either use a drug in very, very low concentrations that may not necessarily be traceable. And again, this is highly doable. You just have to permeate the edge of a drinking vessel or an atmospheric vessel, get the drug on board. It kind of auto-assembles in situ because of nanopharmacology. Very difficult to trace, and it creates a biological downstream effect. Nothing I'm telling you here is sci-fi. It all exists within the medical range, and how we're able to treat a variety of neurological disorders targeting the brain, being able to get in there more specifically, affect certain neural cancers, et cetera. And what we can do with some of these drugs is we can also use these techniques that we're learning on the pharmaceutical side to modify certain bugs. And we spoke earlier about a technique that's become very well known, CRISPR-Cas9, that allows us to literally modify bugs in a variety of different ways. So I now may be able to take a relatively harmless microbiological agent, a bacterium or a virus, do some gene editing and make this thing far more morbidly viable, make it far more virulent, and in some cases even make it far more lethal. But I don't want lethality, at least not necessarily. What I want is high morbidity. I want people to complain. So what do? I go to Des Moines. Ladies and gentlemen and people on the screen, I have nothing against Des Moines. I lived there for 4 years. I go to Des Moines. I infect a couple of sentinel cases in Des Moines. I go to Seattle. I infect a couple of cases there. I go to North Carolina, I go to Wisconsin. What I'm doing is I'm using a dispersion methodology to be able to infect sentinel cases with a highly morbid condition. These individuals complain. Again, this is a central nervous system condition. So they're complaining of whatever the bug may do. It'll produce some cascade of neurological and neuropsychiatric signs and symptoms. And then what I do, the real bug that I use is the internet. I take attribution for that. Yes, I'm a terrorist group. And I have done this by infecting them with a highly lethal agent, and the first signs and symptoms of lethality are X, Y, and Z. These people are really sick with this. But then I say, others who are also infected will show subdromal, predromal signs of lethality, and what that will be is anxiety, sleeplessness, agitation. What I've now done is I've got every individual who is diagnostically hypochondriacal, and I've got every individual who's the worried well flooding the public health system, banging on the door. The CDC comes back and says, nonsense, that's not real. I come back and say, that's fake news. And as a consequence of doing that, what I do is I create a schism between the polis and the public health system. I fracture the integrity of trust and reliance upon the population and its government. And of course, I'll be able to then incur a ripple effect. And if you want to see what this looks like in action, all you need is look back at those days prior to or post 9/11, when individuals were sort of sending white powder through the mail and everything was anthrax. Real story. We had a scare at my institution, and I was in Houston at that time, at my institution, where they literally called in the public safety works, the fire department and EMTs, because someone had spilled the sugar all over a set of envelopes and left it in the mailroom. Panic, panic. Is this viable? Is this capable? Of course it is. Are there other scenarios that individuals could spin? Yes, absolutely. Moreover, you heard earlier about the idea of nanoparticulate matter that can be utilized in a weaponizable way. And here too, we're looking very, very strongly at what nanoparticulate matter can do to the nervous system. Some ongoing studies with our colleagues in the medical branches of NATO have in fact shown that the use of nanoparticulate matter in a scatter arrangement can be used to incur what looks to be broad-scale epidemiological stroke epidemics. So what we're able to do here is infiltrate the brain space with nanoparticulate matter that aggregates in situ, on site in the brain, and does one of two things. Either penetrates from the vascular space, gets in through the bloodstream, gets in through the nose, through the mucosa, or infiltrates the vascular space and clogs it. What is the result? What's called a nanoparticulate stroke, or a hemorrhagic diathesis, fancy word, for it's a predisposition to individuals having brain bleeds. Demonstrated? Oh, absolutely. We're able to show animal models of same, and the Italian group has done a fair amount of work demonstrating that nanoparticulate matter can be highly disruptive, not only of brain vascularity, but brain function. You may not necessarily incur a stroke, but you're going to begin to disrupt the network properties of the brain, and as a result, engage something more of a long wars effect through the use of these types of matters, where you now begin to influence the population in increasingly concentric circles of expansion. Moreover, you heard earlier, and I'm not going to beleaguer the point of the idea of neurosensory devices and a whole host of trans and intracranial pulse stimulators. And of course, these can be used for a variety of things with key individuals. Once again, particularly when it comes to trans and intracranial devices, I'm not looking for this to be weapons of mass use. I'm looking to target key individuals who may then be influential to relative aspects of their representative groups. I can affect individuals' brain functions in a variety of different ways, both positively and negatively, by engaging or disengaging nodes and networks of the brain that therefore affect their cognitions, emotions, and ultimately their behaviors. Moreover, by understanding the way the brain works as nodes and networks and not as key sites that are doing any particular thing, I can also utilize various forms of electromagnetic radiation and energy to be able to disrupt brain function. The brain is an electromagnetic organ, and like any other electromagnetic substance, the integrity of those networks is reliant upon the electromagnetic pulses that flow in between them. Utilizing electromagnetic sensory and disruptive devices in this way, with ever greater fidelity and with ever greater granularity, can be used as not only an organ against individuals, but against groups. And in fact, this is some of the work that we've seen that has been conducted previously in what was the Soviet Union, now Russia, and also China is looking very, very deeply into what electromagnetic pulse generation can do to the brain with regard to treating diseases and also incurring certain disease states in individuals who may then be susceptible, who may be exposed to such pulses. Of course, the dual-use viability of that becomes evident. Something my colleague Jamie Canton likes to play with an awful lot is the idea of specialized neural operations. And here, once again, we're talking about the use of either drugs and or devices to modify the integrity of brain function that we realize can also modify individuals' perception of time and space. We talked earlier about how these may be used in interrogation scenarios, and this too may be used against key individuals to be able to modify their perception of time, their perception of what occurred and what did not, memory modification, etc. If we keep pushing the envelope a little more, we need not limit neurological modification, engagement, and weaponology to the human frontier. We may recognize also that anything biological can then be weaponized. Here what we're talking about primarily is the idea of weaponized non-human animal drones. And clearly the one that comes to mind is something referred to as the DARPA Beetle. This is nothing prototypic. This was a research, development, test, evaluation, and small-scale use enterprise where DARPA was looking to understand how to affect the nervous system of a living organism through the use of integrated biosensors and engaging articulative devices. And what the DARPA Beetle, as well as the DARPA Fly, demonstrated pretty well is that we can harness the nervous system of an insect, particularly a fairly large insect such as a beetle of this magnitude, as well as smaller insects the size of a large bee and perhaps a large fly, as we'll see subsequently. And by harnessing into their nervous system through the use of very, very fine-scale wiring and the use of optogenetics, coupled with an onboard battery pack that is solar sensitive, so the battery never runs out, and the use of onboard RFID sensors that allow us real scale, both sensing and communication with that simulatory pack, it allows us to engage the nervous system of that organism. So that would be as if I'm saying I take a particular thing, I strap it onto my bug, I infiltrate that bug's nervous system, and I control the way it moves. By controlling the way it moves, I control the way it goes. I control its wings pattern. I control where it hovers, where it flies, where it articulates. And what I can also do is I can then couple this to a very, very small scale set of either biosensors or cameras. And what I basically have here is a biodrone. I can go one step further and I can also impregnate that individual organism with a very small scale weaponizable delivery mode. In other words, if I'm using a very, very small scale bioweapon, such as a very potent organotoxin or the delivery of a very small level of microbes that we know can either replicate and infect or is genetically modified to have a very, very high morbidity effect, I can then utilize this not only as a reconnaissance drone, but also as an infiltrative weaponizable drone that can then deliver some payload to a specifically small and contained group in a very specialized way, or if I use enough of them, an ever-expanding larger group. Now, obviously, the reason that DARPA was looking to do this was primarily to understand how nervous systems work and maybe then engage through a variety of techniques. This has now been commercialized into a group that is called Dragonfly. And although Dragonfly explicitly states that their funding has not come from the Department of Defense, and that their iteration of this type of device and integration of a biological organism is not for weaponizable purposes, I think that the potential dual use is evident for any and all to be able to observe the viability of this type of thing to create, essentially, a biological or cyborg drone. So, what I've hoped to have shown you over the past few minutes is essentially this, that neuroscience and neurotechnology are indeed relatively facile. You can get this stuff right off the shelf. There are dedicated efforts to it, not only here in the United States and among our allies, but internationally. And of course, that there is being conducted by a variety of nations, and in some cases, particularly based upon some do-it-yourself stuff that I'll talk about in a moment, this then obviously gives us a much wider opportunity space of not only nations, but non-state actors. The variety of applications that I hope to have shown you. And I think the caveat here is that a lack of commitment on our part does not necessarily mean a lack of commitment on others. In fact, if we see that this is going to be ethically, legally, socially problematic, it becomes important for us to deal with what those issues and problems are, on the one hand, and on the other to address them specifically. Why? Because increasingly neuroscience and neurotechnology is being conducted on the world stage. It's being conducted on the world stage for medical purposes, but the dual usability of brain science and its technologies, as I've hoped to have shown you, is not only evident, it is realizable and operationalizable now, and certainly is on a trajectory towards increased operationalizability over the next 5 to 10 years. Some of the work that I've done with the ongoing support of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories has taken a deep dive into the efforts of China into neuroscience and neurotechnology, and we see this both as tactically labile, that is to be executed now for key purposes in medicine, public life, inclusive of public life beyond what may be the public sphere, but also social life, inclusive of political and the military, and things that are more strategically latent. In other words, in 5 to 10 years, what can be done now to then engage latency on the world stage, both with regard to soft effect and hard effect. Other countries include Russia, and you'll hear more about Russia not only in the course of this conference yesterday and today, but also some of the ongoing work of this group that is focused on Russia, and some of our ongoing work is now looking to Russia with regard primarily to the way they're funding a variety of non-state actors. Certainly India, Iran, North Korea, and South America. And I think one of the other things that becomes important for us to understand is that these efforts are not necessarily wholly conducted in state-level laboratories, university laboratories, or institutionally. Increasingly what we're seeing is a rising cadre of do-it-yourself brain science. This is colloquially referred to as neurobiohacking. And indeed, the biohacking community is of significant interest that there's been an ongoing investment and engagement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation with the biohacking community here in the United States, so as to ensure that what they're doing is not only technically right, but is also ethical, legally good, and to also ensure that this community does not render itself vulnerable to infiltration from external sources who may have capricious, if not nefarious, interests in infiltrating said communities towards creating products, outcomes, and tools that may be disruptive to the public health, public safety, and national security. But increasingly, the availability of these tools, the availability of this knowledge, renders almost all neuroscience and neurotechnology at least viable for potential do-it-yourself engagement. And increasingly what we're seeing is venture capital investment in certain areas of do-it-yourself, and sometimes that venture capital is funded by nation states who have defined interest in weaponizing brain science. That said, I think what we need to understand, as I mentioned before, is that what we can do is provocative, what we should do remains at issue. We've seen this as a superspeedway. Indeed, there are a lot of players, lots of lanes, many, many vehicles. The pace is fast, the prizes potentially in a variety of fields, both medical as well as economic, and certainly within military are big, and there are risks and hazards. The question then becomes, are there race rules that all can participate and play along with or not, and are there race restrictions? Obviously, if we look at some of the ethical, legal, and social issues, they may be parsed into two domains. Those that are focal to the technology, it's new. These are unknown frontiers of science and tech. We don't know everything about the brain. There are, as we say, persistent hard questions. We don't know how the great stuff of cognition, emotions, and behaviors actually arise from the gray stuff of those soupy, sparking neurons. And indeed, given those unknowns, the intersection may then lead to what we call runaway effects, or the fact that we're messing with nature in ways that we've not yet anticipated, and as a consequence, things naturally happen, but we've never seen it before, what is referred to as a Wechselblad effect. And of course, what we need to understand as well is that there are a whole host of ethical, legal issues. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole. We have the panel that deals with that and will hold those issues forth. But they include things like the inviolability of mind, protection of individuals versus their privacy, what represents mitigation of those behaviors and cognitions that may be harmful, whereas what may in fact be manipulation of the brain-mind space, what is valid and reliable, usable and admissible, for example, in international courts of law, and there are indeed standards. This is an entire field called neurolaw. And the idea of what represents norms in a pluralized global society, what we may view as ethically disruptive, problematic, or in some cases distasteful, in other countries and other cultures may not be so. How might we approach this? Well, we were tasked with this a couple of years ago, and we developed something called the Operational Neuroscience and Technology Risk Assessment and Mitigation Paradigm. Since, in fact, it was a speedway, we figured, well, let's do something to get us on the on-ramp. And what this really involves is the need to evaluate neuroscientific capabilities and their limitations, realistically, through a lens of what is capable now, what are the limitations, do those limitations throw down a challenge and opportunity for delimitations, and look within a 10-year time span. What are the parameters of possible use, particularly of interest in this space, in national security, intelligence, defense, and warfare operations? What are the benefit, risk, and harm parameters that need to be thrown into any calculus of ethical balance? And then frame these within context of application. This isn't new. Brzezinski addressed this some 40 years ago, recognizing that the brain could and probably will be the next battle space. We are now poised precipitously on the reality of that challenge. How do we actually navigate that space? Well, this is a work in progress. Obviously, identifying threats and harms, creating strategies, modeling effectively, not just in a speculative way, but in a preparedness way, that becomes critical. There are indeed contingencies and exigencies that need to be modeled into this calculus. These include the technical rightness of any neuroscientific and technological use in national security, defining that we are using the technologies and techniques in the right ways. And although one may think that's axiomatic, it is not very often. We're using them in particular ways and extracting meanings from them that are not apparent. This happens all the time with neuroimaging. Moreover, situational variables that are germane to national security use, evaluation and revision of existing ethical guidelines, and our group has worked with that to some extent, and then establishing real frameworks that are not only viable nationally. As we said, I think the agenda here is that we don't necessarily want to play a fair fight, and I think that's true with virtually every military operation. Let's face it, some of this stuff may need to have some type of protective parentalism. It may need to be somewhat classified. I don't want to show the other team my playbook on Saturday and expect to win the game on Sunday. But by the same token, there needs to be some level of transparency to engage the public in what this discourse is, so that yes, we can achieve the mission, but do so in such a way that is morally sound and so as to keep our honor clean. So the question then becomes, what ethics? I don't necessarily have the answer for you. Some of the ongoing work of our group, together with my colleagues Michael Tennyson and John Moreno, have explored what ethical possibilities might be viable for such applications. Civilian ethics, well, what type? And my colleague Linda McDonald-Glenn deals an awful lot with science and technology ethics, and she'll be on the panel this afternoon and have a specific lecture dealing with those. The question is, are they enough? Are civilian ethics that deal with science and technology adequate and sufficient? Biomedical ethics. Here, understand the principal maxim is doing good, but what does the good mean when we're looking at these in national security, intelligence, and defense agenda? Military ethics. Well, what military ethics do we use? Justification for warfare, just use and fair use in warfare. In which case, we're taking a look at things like proportionality, we're taking a look at things like relativity, we're taking a look at extent of use. And where would we use neuroscientific and neurotechnological capability? In a preventive way, in a responsive way? And if in fact we're trying to use these preventively, might perhaps an older Augustinian maxim, that is, jus contra bellum, justification for use to prevent war, open up a broader index of ethical possibilities? And if that's the case, how might these then be leveraged on the world stage? In other words, what might be good for us might not be good somewhere else. And what then do we do with regard to the military-civilian balance, with regard to things like transparency and the individual who may have been a military operator at one point in their life and then come back into civilian life on another point in their life? And moreover, what does this mean for global discourses for those countries that look to pursue neuroscience and technology for economic gain, clearly as a potential soft weapon, but also have infrastructures that allow its relative seamless infusion into the military space? So what I pose to you here is the problem we're faced with. As we're unraveling this potentially Gordian knot of the brain, what we may actually be doing is opening up a potential can of worms with the way brain science and its techniques and technologies not only can be used, but will be used, and therefore we need to confront, address, guide, and govern those ways it should be used so as to be able to allow a relatively strong operational viability and understand that, in fact, it could be a weak link in any national security, intelligence, and defense chain of operations.